A Russian Su-35, one of the most capable fighters Vladimir Putin's Air Force can put into the sky, crosses into contested airspace near the Eastern Front. It never sees what is coming. Somewhere behind it, a slow, unglamorous turboprop with a massive radar bolted to its spine has already picked up the track, built a firing solution, and quietly handed it to a Ukrainian F-16 waiting well outside the threat ring. The Russian pilot has no idea he has already been found. One missile later, the jet is going down 8 miles from the Russian border. The pilot ejects. He survives. And 2 weeks pass in near total silence. No official confirmation from either side, until the single most senior military officer in the United States stands in front of the United States Senate and says, out loud, on the record, something that has never been confirmed before in this entire war. Read that again, because the sentence itself is the story. Recently, we had the first air-to-air kill where a Ukrainian F-16 shot down a Russian fighter. That is General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top uniformed officer in the American military, telling the Senate Appropriations Committee something Kyiv had spent 2 weeks not confirming on its own. Not a Ukrainian press release, not a Telegram channel. The Pentagon's own chairman, under oath, in a budget hearing, closing the book on a milestone that Western-supplied fighters in Ukrainian hands had never achieved before in more than 2 years of flying combat missions over this war. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why that single sentence matters as much as it does, you need to understand exactly what Ukrainian F-16 pilots have and have not been doing with these aircraft since they first arrived. The jets landed in Ukraine in 2024 after NATO allies trained Ukrainian pilots essentially from scratch. And for most of the 2 years since, their actual combat record has been almost entirely defensive. Shooting down cruise missiles, shooting down long-range attack drones, playing goalkeeper against an unrelenting nightly barrage rather than hunting anything in the air themselves. That is not a criticism of the pilots or the platform. It is a function of what the tactical picture and the available missile stocks allowed for during those 2 years. An F-16 is one of the most capable multi-role fighters ever built, and for 2 years, Ukraine was using it almost entirely to swat down the cheapest, slowest threats Russia could throw across the border, because that was the fight in front of it. This is where the story changes completely, because the July 8th engagement is the first confirmed evidence that the fight in front of it has expanded to include Russia's own fighter fleet. It helps to understand exactly how modest Ukraine's Western fighter fleet still is, because that context is what makes a single confirmed kill significant rather than incidental. Ukraine's F-16 fleet has grown gradually since 2024, built up through incremental pledges from multiple NATO members rather than a single large transfer, and the country has already lost several of those jets in the process, both to enemy action and, in at least one widely reported case, to a friendly fire incident during a chaotic mass drone and missile attack. Belgium has committed to eventually transferring its entire F-16 fleet to Ukraine as it moves its own air force onto F-35s, a gradual handover rather than an immediate one, with additional aircraft still arriving this year. Alongside the F-16s, Ukraine has also brought French-supplied Mirage 2000 fighters into service and has a longer-term commitment from Sweden for Gripen fighters still to come, meaning the country is not simply operating a single Western airframe, but is in the middle of assembling an entire mixed fleet of NATO standard aircraft, each one wired into the same Link 16 backbone the Saab radar planes feed into. Every new airframe that arrives does not just add another jet to the order of battle, it adds another node that can receive the same targeting picture, which is precisely why a single confirmed kill from this system carries implications well beyond the one Su-35 that was actually lost. Here's exactly what has been confirmed layer by layer, because the way this story became public matters almost as much as the kill itself. On July 8th, Ukraine's Air Force announced in Telegram that it had shot down a Russian Su-35 over eastern Ukraine without specifying what weapon or platform had done it. Pro-Russian military channels responded almost immediately with a different account, claiming that 3 Ukrainian aircraft, 2 of them F-16s, along with a Patriot air defense battery, had all been involved in the same engagement, and crediting the actual kill to the Patriot system rather than to either fighter. The pilot, according to that same account, ejected and was recovered. For nearly 2 weeks, that ambiguity sat unresolved. A Ukrainian claim without a named weapon, and a Russian counter-narrative shifting credit toward a ground-based system rather than an aircraft. Then, on July 21st, Kane told the Senate Appropriations Committee, without naming the Russian aircraft type, that Ukraine's F-16 fleet had scored its first confirmed air-to-air kill. Ukrainian defense outlet Militarny assessed almost immediately that his statement could only be referring to the July 8th Su-35 loss. The Pentagon's own chairman had just resolved, in a single sentence to Congress, an ambiguity Russian propaganda channels had been actively working to muddy for 2 weeks. Now let's actually dissect what Kane said, because the specific framing he used tells you exactly what the Pentagon wants this moment to represent. He did not present the kill as an isolated event. I want to highlight the incredible work the Ukrainian industrial base is doing as they scale their own capabilities, he told the committee, tying the shoot-down directly to what he called Ukraine's layered defense, a network of overlapping radar, missile, and fighter systems designed so that if one layer misses an incoming threat, another one catches it. That framing matters because it reframes a single dogfight as evidence of something structural rather than lucky, a functioning system rather than a one-off. And that is precisely the argument Kane was making to lawmakers who were, in the same hearing, questioning years of stalled air defense funding. The message being delivered to Congress was not simply that Ukraine won a fight. It was that the specific combination of Western hardware, Western training, and Western funding that Congress has spent years debating had just produced a tangible, attributable result on the battlefield. A Russian fighter destroyed in the air by a jet built to fight Soviet aircraft more than half a century ago. The setting of that testimony is worth understanding on its own terms, because a hearing on the Department of Defense's budget request is not a neutral venue. It is the exact forum where competing claims about whether continued military aid to Ukraine is producing results get tested against real numbers rather than talking points. Years of debate in Washington over sustaining air defense funding for Ukraine have circled around a version of the same question: whether the hardware being sent is actually translating into battlefield outcomes proportionate to its cost, or whether it is being absorbed into an attritional war with no clear return on the investment. A chairman of the Joint Chiefs choosing to introduce a specific, previously unconfirmed combat result into exactly that hearing, unprompted, framed explicitly around the layered defense concept that years of funding decisions were built to support, is not incidental testimony. It is evidence being entered into the record at the precise moment it carries the most weight for the funding argument it supports. And here's where it gets significantly worse for anyone trying to track what is actually happening in the skies over this war, because the information environment surrounding this single kill is worth sitting with on its own. Russian state media has not officially acknowledged the loss of the Su-35 at all. Pro-Russian military bloggers, the same community that first floated the Patriot explanation, have not walked that claim back, even after Kane's testimony. That gap matters for the same reason gaps like it have mattered throughout this war. When the Pentagon's most senior uniformed officer puts a specific claim on the record in sworn testimony to Congress that carries a different evidentiary weight than a telegram post from either side, and the fact that Russia's own aviation-focused propaganda channels have had 2 full weeks to correct the record and have chosen not to tell you something about which version of events better survives scrutiny. This is not the first time this exact pattern has played out in this war. Credit shifted toward a ground-based system rather than an aircraft, an unnamed platform, a claim that sits unconfirmed for weeks before outside testimony settles it. It matters here specifically because the Su-35 is not a minor export item sitting only inside Russia's own inventory. It is the backbone of Russia's operational fighter fleet, and one of the country's more significant defense export products, sold to multiple foreign militaries who have staked real money and real strategic planning on the platform's combat reputation. A confirmed loss to a Western fighter operating off Western sensor and data link technology is exactly the kind of result that reverberates well beyond this single war into the calculations of every country currently flying or considering buying the same aircraft. That reverberation is not abstract. Export customers for a fighter platform are not simply buying an airframe. They are buying a reputation built on documented combat performance and a documented loss in beyond visual range air-to-air combat against a smaller, older Western jet operating with better sensor support is precisely the kind of data point that shows up in briefings for every foreign air force currently deciding whether to invest further in the same aircraft family or shift toward alternatives. Wars are rarely fought purely for the territory or the immediate tactical objective in front of the units involved. They also function as continuous, unplanned advertising for the hardware being used, and a single verified kill like this one carries weight in showrooms and defense ministries thousands of miles from the actual engagement, long after the wreckage of the specific aircraft involved has been cleared from the ground where it came down. That same week produced a second, far more extraordinary claim that deserves to be handled with real caution rather than repeated as settled fact. On July 23rd, a Russian Su-57, the country's only operational 5th-generation stealth fighter, crashed in the Moscow region. The pilot ejected safely. Russia's Ministry of Defense attributed the crash to a technical malfunction. A Ukrainian volunteer intelligence collective called Inform Napalm made a considerably more dramatic claim that Ukrainian cyber specialists had spent days analyzing intercepted training data from a Russian air defense unit known as BARS Moscow, identified vulnerabilities in its targeting software, and used those vulnerabilities to manipulate the system into misidentifying and firing on its own aircraft. Read that carefully because the honest framing matters here. This is a claim from a single pro-Ukrainian OSINT group, not an official Ukrainian government statement, not something independently verified by outside investigators, and not something Russia has acknowledged as anything other than a mechanical failure. Russian military bloggers themselves, notably, have raised their own doubts publicly about the official malfunction explanation, and pointed fingers at the same air defense unit, which is itself interesting, a crack of doubt appearing inside Russia's own information space rather than only from Ukrainian sources. But a claim this specific, an aircraft this valuable, a fifth-generation stealth fighter Russia has only ever fielded in small numbers, deserves to be reported as exactly what it currently is. An unconfirmed but increasingly corroborated allegation, not a confirmed operational fact, the way the F-16 kill now is. It is worth noting that this is not the first time this specific group has produced claims about the Su-57 program that later proved difficult for Russia to fully dismiss. The same collective published a set of leaked documents in 2025 describing internal manufacturing details from a Russian component supplier tied to the jet, material that was independently translated and picked up by outlets in more than a dozen countries at the time. That track record does not make the current claim automatically true. Single-source intelligence collectives get things wrong, and a friendly fire narrative is exactly the kind of story that serves an obvious propaganda purpose for the side reporting it. But it is also not a group with a documented history of fabricating claims about this specific aircraft program out of nothing, which is part of why the story is being treated with more caution than dismissal by outlets covering it, and why Russian military bloggers questioning their own government's technical malfunction explanation carries real weight regardless of how the cyber operation claim itself eventually holds up. Now, for the mechanism behind the confirmed kill, because this is where the actual military story lives, and it explains why this single engagement is being treated as evidence of something bigger than one lucky shot. The system that made the July 8th kill possible starts with 2 aircraft Sweden has provided to Ukraine, Saab 340 turboprops modified into airborne early warning and control platforms, carrying the PS-890 Iri radar mounted along the top of the fuselage. These are not fighters. They carry no weapons. Their entire purpose is detection, tracking targets at ranges reported up to 250 kilometers or more, well beyond what any ground-based Ukrainian radar could see given the terrain and the distances involved. Feeding that radar picture into Ukraine's Western fighter fleet, the F-16s, the Mirage 2000s, through the NATO standard Link 16 tactical data network changes the entire character of an engagement. Instead of an F-16 pilot flying a patrol and hoping to stumble into visual or short-range radar contact with an enemy aircraft, the pilot receives a complete firing solution before the enemy aircraft is anywhere close enough to know it has been found. The target arrives already boxed in, already ranged, and by the time an AMRAAM missile is in the air, the Russian pilot on the other end typically has no idea the engagement has even started. Compare that to how Russia's own fighter fleet is built to operate, because the contrast is the entire reason this particular kill matters beyond the single airframe lost. Russia's combat aviation doctrine leans heavily on ground control intercept. Radar sites on the ground feeding target data up to fighters in the air. That system works, but it carries an inherent lag that a real-time airborne radar picture does not. And in an engagement measured in seconds rather than minutes, that lag is the difference between a pilot who sees the threat coming and a pilot who does not see it at all until the missile is already inbound. Russia does maintain its own airborne early warning capability in the form of A-50 aircraft, but the fleet has already taken real losses earlier in this war, with 1 aircraft destroyed over the Sea of Azov and another lost on the ground during a Ukrainian drone strike deep inside Russian territory, and those aircraft are neither cheap nor quickly replaceable. Russia has only ever fielded a small number of them at any given time. A doctrine built around ground radar and a shrinking handful of aging airborne platforms is structurally slower to react than a doctrine built around a dedicated radar aircraft feeding a live picture directly into a networked fighter. And July 8th is the first time that structural gap produced a confirmed kill rather than just a theoretical advantage. The missile mismatch underneath that sensor gap deserves its own explanation, because it is not simply about who sees the target first. It is about who can afford to fire first from a safer distance. The AIM-120 AMRAAM, carried by Ukraine's F-16s, is a proven beyond visual range weapon, but its effective range depends heavily on the launching aircraft having accurate, timely targeting data, exactly what a Saab-Q'd intercept provides. Russia's own long-range answer, the R-37M, carried by late-model Su-35 and Su-30 variants, is in some respects an even longer-range weapon on paper, capable of engaging targets before an AMRAAM could theoretically reach back. But a longer-ranged missile only matters if the launching pilot has enough warning and enough confidence in the targeting picture to use that range advantage before the opposing aircraft closes in, and a pilot relying on a ground-fed picture with built-in lag is, in practice, often not in a position to exploit a missile's full engagement envelope the way a pilot receiving a live airborne radar feed can. That is the deeper reason the July 8th kill is being read as more than a single unlucky patrol. It suggests that even where Russia holds a theoretical hardware advantage on paper, in missile range or aircraft size, a faster and more accurate sensor-to-shooter chain on the Ukrainian side can still close that gap in practice. Here are the operational numbers anchoring where this actually stands, rather than leaving it as impression. One confirmed air-to-air kill by a Ukrainian F-16, publicly verified by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff on July 21st, referencing an engagement that took place on July 8th. Independent open-source tracking groups have documented roughly 9 confirmed Su-35 losses across the broader war to date, a number likely conservative since it only counts losses with visual confirmation. Ukraine's F-16 fleet has been credited, according to Ukrainian Air Force statements, with shooting down roughly 2,200 of an estimated 3,000 Russian drones and missiles the country has intercepted, a figure that underscores just how overwhelmingly defensive the platform's actual combat record has been up to this point. 2 Saab 340 AEW&C aircraft delivered to Ukraine as part of a Swedish military aid package worth more than $1 billion, explicitly built around expanding what officials on both sides describe as Ukraine's layered air defense network. And one still unconfirmed but increasingly scrutinized claim of a Russian Su-57 lost to what may have been a cyber-enabled friendly fire incident inside Russia's own capital defense zone, an incident Russian officials have called mechanical failure and Russian military bloggers themselves have started to publicly question. This is where 3 separate but converging pressure points come together, and understanding the convergence is what separates this story from a single, isolated dogfight. The technological track is the sensor-to-shooter chain itself, a Swedish radar plane, a NATO standard data link, and an American-built fighter, 3 different countries, hardware functioning as a single targeting system against a Russian Air Force that, at least in this specific engagement, was still working off a slower, ground-dependent picture. The credibility track is what Kane's testimony actually accomplished, taking a claim that had been sitting in propaganda limbo for 2 weeks and settling it with the institutional weight of sworn congressional testimony, which matters enormously for how this specific engagement gets treated in the historical record of this war going forward. And the psychological track is what this does inside Russia's own fighter community specifically, because an Air Force that has spent 2 years operating with what amounted to air superiority in most contested airspace now has to reckon with the possibility that any Su-35 crossing into contested territory could be found, tracked, and killed before its own pilot ever sees the threat coming, a fundamentally different risk calculation than the one Russian pilots have been flying under for most of this war. Now go inside what this actually does to Russian tactics and Russian confidence going forward, because a single confirmed kill rarely stays a single confirmed kill in modern air warfare. It tends to change behavior on both sides almost immediately. Russia's most likely response is not to abandon the Su-35 as a platform. It remains one of the more capable aircraft in the country's inventory, and Russian state manufacturer Rostec has publicly claimed the type has more confirmed air-to-air kills than any other Russian fighter across the broader war. The more likely response is a shift in how those aircraft are employed, more conservative patrol patterns, tighter coordination with whatever remains of Russia's shrinking A-50 fleet, and a heavier reliance on longer-range missiles like the R-37M, specifically to try to engage Ukrainian fighters before they can close within range of the Saab-Q'd intercepts that made the July 8th kill possible in the first place. Whether that adaptation actually neutralizes the advantage Ukraine's networked sensor chain currently holds, or simply pushes the same contest out to longer range, where Russia's larger radar and longer range missiles on the Su-35 and Su-30 variants still carry real advantages of their own, is the open tactical question hanging over every engagement that follows this one. It is worth being honest about scale here too, because a single confirmed kill does not, on its own, tip the balance of an air war between a country the size of Russia and a much smaller Ukrainian air force. Russia's combat aviation fleet remains, on paper, one of the largest in the world, built around large numbers of Su-30, Su-34, and Su-35 variants that Moscow can still generate in meaningful quantities even after years of attritional losses. What a single confirmed kill actually does is different from tipping a numerical balance. It establishes a proof of concept, a demonstration that the specific combination of networked sensors and Western fighters Ukraine has spent 2 years building toward can, under the right conditions, defeat one of Russia's more capable fourth-generation platforms in a fair fight rather than only in a defensive intercept against a drone. Whether that proof of concept scales into a sustained pattern of similar kills depends heavily on variables that are still unresolved. How quickly Russia adapts its own patrol patterns and standoff missile tactics in response, how many more Saab-linked fighters Ukraine can keep flying and keep supplied with the specific missiles that made this kill possible, and how much of Ukraine's own airspace remains contested enough for engagements like this to keep happening, rather than pushing the fighting further back from the front line entirely. The honest strategic assessment has to separate what is confirmed from what is still speculative, because conflating the two does a disservice to how significant the confirmed part of this story actually is on its own. The F-16 kill is confirmed, sourced to the Pentagon's own chairman, and represents a genuine milestone, the first time in more than 2 years of combat operations that a Western fighter in Ukrainian hands has won an engagement against a crewed Russian aircraft rather than a drone or missile. That is significant regardless of what happens with the Su-57 claim, because it validates in a single verified data point the entire theory behind years of Western investment in exactly this kind of networked, sensor-fused air defense architecture. The Su-57 claim is a different category of story entirely, a serious and detailed allegation from a credible open-source intelligence collective, corroborated in part by cracks of doubt inside Russia's own military blogging community, but still resting on claims that have not been independently verified by outside investigators or acknowledged by any government. Both stories point in the same broader direction, a Russian Air Force increasingly vulnerable not just to Ukrainian missiles, but to the layered, networked systems built specifically to exploit the gaps in Russia's own more centralized approach to air defense and air combat, but only one of them currently qualifies as confirmed operational fact. There is a structural risk sitting underneath both of these stories that deserves its own attention, distinct from the tactical questions of who shot down what. An Air Force whose own pilots and defense bloggers are beginning to question whether their air defense systems can be trusted not to fire on friendly aircraft, whether that specific Su-57 incident is ultimately confirmed as sabotage or not, faces a genuine institutional problem that outlasts any single engagement. Trust in your own air defense network is not a minor operational detail. It is the foundation that allows pilots to fly aggressive missions near contested and defended airspace in the first place. And doubt about that trust, once introduced, tends to produce more conservative flying, slower response times, and second-guessing that shows up in performance long after the specific incident that caused it fades from headlines. Combine that with a confirmed loss of air superiority in at least one engagement against a networked Western sensor chain, and Russia's fighter fleet is facing pressure from 2 different directions at once, an external threat it did not fully see coming on July 8th, and an internal credibility question about its own defenses that emerged just over 2 weeks later. That second pressure point compounds in a way that is easy to underestimate from the outside. Bars Moscow, the specific air defense unit at the center of the Su-57 allegation, was only publicly announced by Russian authorities in mid-June, a relatively new addition to the capital's defensive layer built specifically to counter the kind of long-range Ukrainian drone strikes that have periodically reached deep into Russian territory throughout this war. A unit that knew, tasked with defending the airspace over the country's own capital, becoming the center of an allegation that it was manipulated into destroying one of the Air Force's most expensive and limited production aircraft, is a considerably more sensitive story inside Russia than a battlefield loss on the Eastern Front would be. Losses near the front line are, however grimly, an expected feature of an active war zone. A friendly fire incident inside the air defense ring protecting Moscow itself, whether ultimately proven to be sabotage or genuine mechanical failure, raises uncomfortable questions about the reliability of systems built to protect the most politically sensitive airspace in the country. And that is precisely the kind of story a government has every incentive to bury under the simplest possible explanation, whether or not that explanation turns out to be the accurate one. What happens next depends on questions that neither government has fully answered yet in public. Whether Ukraine's SOB-linked sensor network can keep generating engagements like the July 8th kill at any meaningful frequency, or whether this remains a rare, hard-won exception in a war still overwhelmingly dominated by drones, artillery, and missile exchanges, rather than crude air-to-air combat. Whether Russia responds to a confirmed loss of one of its more capable fighters by pulling its Su-35 patrols further back from contested airspace, accepting a more defensive posture in the air in exchange for reduced exposure, or by pushing harder to restore its own airborne radar coverage despite the attrition its A-50 fleet has already suffered. And whether the unresolved Su-57 question gets a real answer at all, from Russian investigators, from independent analysts, or simply from watching whether Bars Moscow keeps operating exactly as it did before, a silence that would itself tell you something about how seriously Moscow is taking the allegation internally, regardless of what it says publicly. Go back to the moment this story actually started, not the Senate hearing, not the 2 weeks of conflicting telegram claims, but the engagement itself. A Russian pilot crossing into contested airspace, confident enough in a 4th-generation fighter that outweighs an F-16 by nearly 2-1, never seeing the radar picture that had already been built and handed off before his jet was anywhere near visual range. That gap between what the Russian pilot believed about his own visibility and what was actually true about it is the entire story compressed into a single moment, and it is a gap that a Swedish radar plane, a NATO data link, and an American fighter combined to expose for the first time in this war on July 8th. Whether that gap closes as Russia adapts its tactics or widens further as Ukraine's networked sensor architecture keeps expanding with more aircraft and more data-linked platforms feeding into it, is the question that will decide how many more Su-35s and possibly how many more Su-57s end up added to a list that, as of this week, the Pentagon's own chairman has now confirmed is no longer sitting at 0.